There's a photograph in the Library of Congress from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. You can look it up yourself. It shows a Filipino man in formal Western clothing, suit, tie, polished shoes, standing in front of an assembly hall in the Philippine section of the fair. The caption calls him a Filipino belle, representing the higher type of islanders. Right next to it, another photograph. Same fair, same exhibit, different person. This one's labeled a native of the Philippines at the fair. Minimal clothing, positioned to look primitive, both from the same place, both at the same event, both people from the Philippines, but one is dressed to show civilization. The other is dressed to show savagery. That's when I started asking questions about the world's fairs. Between 1889 and 1940, these international expositions displayed over 35,000 people from around the world in what we now call human zoos. Living exhibits, ethnological displays, whatever name made it sound scientific instead of degrading. I spent weeks in archives looking at the photographs. Not the official fair photographs, the ones taken for publicity, staged to show primitives in crude villages. I was looking at the other photographs, the private studio portraits, the ones taken away from the crowds. And when I found them, I saw something that didn't match the official story. I saw people who didn't look primitive at all, people who looked like they'd been living in advanced civilizations right up until they were shipped to America and told to perform being savages. The official explanation is colonialism, scientific racism, the need to justify imperialism by proving white superiority. And yes, that's absolutely part of it. But what if there's something else? What if some of these people were from populations that had to be humiliated, made to look backward, stripped of their dignity and displayed as examples of what the world was like before progress? What if they were Tartarians being erased from history in front of 20 million witnesses? The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair ran from April 30th to December 1st, 1904. Nearly 20 million people attended over 7 months. It was massive. 1,200 acres, over 1,500 buildings. The fair cost $15 million to stage, equivalent to about $500 million today. The Philippine reservation was the largest single section, 47 acres. Over 1,000 Filipino people brought to St. Louis specifically to be displayed. The War Department coordinated their collection and transport with support from William Howard Taft, the U.S. military governor of the Philippines. Cost? $1.5 million. That's $35 million in today's dollars, just for shipping and housing people to be stared at. 99 out of 100 visitors went to the Philippine exhibit. It was the most popular attraction, more popular than the Ferris wheel, more popular than the X-ray machine, the first air conditioner, the first player piano. People came to see other people. The exhibit featured mock battles between Filipino insurgents and American soldiers, reenactments of the Philippine-American War, which had officially ended in 1902 but was still being fought on several islands. The battles were staged to portray Filipinos as savage rebels who needed to be pacified by superior American forces. The crowd cheered for the Americans, booed for the Filipinos. Some of the Filipino performers were injured during these reenactments, some were killed. 17 people died during the 7 months of the fair, from pneumonia, from malnutrition, from suicide. But when I started looking at photographs taken of these same people, not the staged fair photographs, but the formal studio portraits made away from the crowds, everything I'd been told about primitive peoples fell apart. The Gerhard sisters, M.A. and Mamie Gerhard, operated a portrait studio on Olive Street in St. Louis. They were the first women to run a photography studio in the city. During the fair, they photographed individuals and families from the exhibits, formal studio portraits, natural lighting, sensitive, careful composition. The Gerhard sisters' photographs are in the Missouri Historical Society collection. Available online. Anyone can view them. And the people in those photographs don't look primitive. They look dignified, intelligent. Many are dressed in fine traditional clothing with intricate embroidery, precise tailoring, sophisticated design. Some are in Western suits. Some wear a mix of traditional and Western elements. But none of them look like savages. They look like people from advanced civilizations who happen to wear different clothes. That's not how they were displayed at the fair. At the fair, they were in recreated native villages designed to look crude. They were forced to perform daily tasks for crowds. The Igorot people were required to butcher and eat a dog every morning so visitors could watch and be shocked. The Igorot traditionally ate dog only for ritual and ceremonial purposes, not daily. But fair organizers supplied dogs constantly, made them perform this act over and over because it reinforced the narrative. These people are savages. One of the participants, Ramon Ochoa, was classified as a pensionado, an ambassador of sorts, meant to show how Western education had civilized the Filipinos. He wore a suit, gave speeches, demonstrated progress. His great-granddaughter, Rhea Unson, found his photograph in the Missouri Historical Society archives decades later. She saw him standing on the steps of Festival Hall at the fair, well-dressed, poised, educated. But he was standing there specifically to be contrasted with the Igorot people in the primitive village nearby. The message was clear. Look how savage they are, and look how civilized they can become under American guidance. Except the Igorot people weren't actually savage. They were sophisticated people with complex cultures, advanced metalworking, intricate social structures, but none of that was shown. What was shown was a performance designed to justify colonialism, or so we're told. But when I started looking at other world's fairs, going back to 1889, I found the same pattern repeating. Sophisticated people displayed as primitives, degrading performances, and photographs that told a completely different story than the exhibits themselves. The 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition featured a Dahomey village with 60 men and 40 women from what's now Benin. They were displayed in constructed huts, forced to perform traditional ceremonies on demand for crowds who came specifically to see savages. But it was what happened to the Inuit people that revealed how these exhibits really worked. They were forced to wear warm clothing in Chicago's summer heat. When some protested the conditions, they were locked in and confined. Think about that. They had to escape, like prisoners. Because that's what they were. It took a court petition, a legal battle to be recognized as human beings with rights, and a clandestine nighttime escape with help from a Moravian minister to finally free them. And then there was the Ainu schoolteacher from Japan. He was displayed at an exposition to raise money for his schoolhouse because the Japanese government refused to pay. He gave eloquent speeches while wearing traditional dress. The spectators didn't know what to do with him. He was supposed to be primitive, but he spoke with intelligence and purpose that contradicted everything the exhibit claimed about him. Anonymous Japanese journalists condemned the exhibits, calling them inhumane, but the exhibitions continued. The 1893 fair also displayed multiple Native American peoples: Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, Uxeti-Sakowin, Kwakwaka'wakw from the northwest coast, Penobscot from Maine, Haudenosaunee in longhouses, Dene people from Colorado. Some were treated with respect and paid fairly for their participation. Others were essentially imprisoned and exploited. The difference depended on who was organizing their section and whether they had negotiated power. But even those treated well were still being displayed, still being categorized, still being shown as examples of primitive peoples who needed Western civilization to progress. And here's the thing about the Native American exhibits that bothers me most. Many of these people came from cultures that built massive earthwork complexes, precision cliff dwellings, sophisticated stone structures across the Americas, evidence of advanced engineering and astronomical knowledge, but none of that was shown at the fairs. Instead, teepees and traditional dress, as if that's all they ever were. 1889 Paris Exposition with 400 indigenous people displayed. 1901 Pan American Exposition. 1904 St. Louis. 1924 British Empire Exhibition with 273 people from Britain's colonies displayed in local conditions. 1925 Bellevue Zoo in Manchester with a display literally called Cannibals. These went on for decades. Tens of thousands of people displayed. Millions of visitors consuming the spectacle, all reinforcing the same message. White Western civilization is superior, everyone else is primitive, and imperialism is a benevolent act of bringing progress to savages. But it wasn't just the degradation that made me connect this to Tartaria. It was when it happened. The peak period of human zoos at World's Fairs is 1889 to 1940. 50 years of displaying people. Those are the same decades when Tartarian architectural style disappears, when elaborate buildings get destroyed and replaced with simpler structures, when populations get displaced, are renamed, scattered. The orphan crisis peaks in the 1850s to 1880s, 250,000 children relocated and renamed. The major urban fires destroy advanced architecture from the 1850s through 1900s. And right in the middle of all this, World's Fairs start displaying people from colonized territories as primitives. The timing isn't random. I went back to the photographs, really looked at them this time. The Gerhard sisters photographed people from the Philippines, from Africa, from the Pacific Islands, from the Americas, formal portraits, studio lighting, dignified poses. Many are wearing elaborate traditional clothing, embroidered tunics, precisely woven fabrics, metalwork jewelry with intricate designs, headdresses with complex construction. That's not primitive, that's sophisticated craftsmanship. That's evidence of advanced textile production, metallurgy, design capability. The architecture they're supposedly from is also interesting. The recreated native villages at the fairs were crude, thatched huts, simple construction, designed to look backward. But When you look at historical photographs of actual villages in the Philippines, in Africa, in the Pacific Islands before colonization, you see something different. You see precision stone construction, elaborate wooden buildings with complex joinery, sophisticated urban planning. The people at the fairs weren't living in their actual architecture, they were living in dumbed-down versions, specifically constructed to look primitive. Why? The official answer is showmanship, creating a spectacle, making the exhibits more dramatic for paying audiences. But what if the real architecture was too sophisticated to match the narrative? What if the fairgoers might look at actual buildings from the Philippines or Dahomey and say, wait, this doesn't look primitive at all, this looks advanced. So instead, they built fake versions, crude replicas designed to reinforce the story they wanted to tell. There's something specific about the 1904 St. Louis Fair that reveals how deliberate this really was. William J. McGee was head of the anthropology department. He was a prominent ethnologist who believed human races could be ranked according to intelligence, morality, and progress, not just different, ranked on a scale, with white Europeans at the top. McGee arranged for indigenous people to be displayed in enclosed villages, actual fences around them, making them literally human zoos. His stated goal was to demonstrate the progress from dark prime to highest enlightenment, from savagery to civic organization. An evolutionary ladder with Europeans at the top and everyone else climbing up toward civilization. To prove his theories, McGee organized anthropology days on August 12th and 13th, 1904, athletic competitions among the exhibited people. The idea was to use sports, supposedly objective, measurable, to demonstrate biological and cultural rankings of civilization. Science, he called it. Empirical data. About 100 indigenous men participated, no women allowed. They competed in running, jumping, throwing, climbing, swimming, events specifically chosen to test martial worth and physical virility. The assumption was that primitive peoples would excel at physical tasks, but lack the refinement for true civilization. But there was a problem. Many participants refused to compete. Others performed poorly on purpose or didn't take it seriously because they weren't trained athletes and the whole thing seemed ridiculous to them. Some mocked the competitions openly. The experiment was a scientific failure. The data didn't support McGee's theories, but the message got through to the 20 million fairgoers anyway. These people are inferior. The fact that they didn't perform well in arbitrary athletic contests was presented as proof of their inferiority. Never mind that they hadn't trained for those specific events, and many were actively protesting. Except they weren't actually inferior. They were regular people, skilled artisans, community leaders, parents, teachers, being forced to perform in made-up competitions under degrading conditions while crowds judged them. McGee also wanted to photograph and measure the exhibited people for scientific data, cranial capacity, reaction time, memory tests, emotional responses. He was building databases to prove racial hierarchies through what he called objective measurement. But many refused to be photographed or measured. They wouldn't cooperate with the researchers trying to categorize them as less than human. They turned away from the cameras. They refused to sit for the cranial measurements. They walked out of the memory tests. Think about what that means. These people understood what was happening. They recognized they were being studied like specimens. They knew the measurements were being used to claim they were biologically inferior. And they refused to participate. That's not the behavior of primitives who don't understand science. That's the behavior of people who understood exactly what was being done to them and resisted the only way they could. The geographic distribution bothers me too. The 1904 St. Louis Fair displayed people from the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, Africa, Japan, Patagonia, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, multiple continents, diverse populations. But look at what connects them. They're all regions with architectural anomalies, places where you find precision stonework that supposedly shouldn't exist. Advanced construction in locations the official history says were primitive. The Philippines, elaborate stone fortifications, sophisticated urban planning in pre-colonial Manila. Japan, the Ainu people had complex wooden architecture and advanced metalworking. Patagonia, the Tehuelche. People's territory includes megalithic stone structures that don't fit the primitive narrative. Dahomey, now Benin, massive earthwork fortifications, sophisticated city planning in pre-colonial Benin City. Native Americans, mound complexes, cliff dwellings, stone structures across the Americas that demonstrate advanced engineering. These aren't primitive peoples. These are populations with architectural and engineering accomplishments that challenge the timeline of civilization. And they're all on display at World's Fairs, dressed in crude replicas of their actual environments, performing for crowds who are told this is what savagery looks like. There's one more photograph I need to show you. It's from the 1904 fair. Two people. The caption reads, 2 fashion plates, Here are shown Dado Facundo, the Beau Brummel of the Moro in fancy dress, and Sumlia, leader of the feminine 400, in their most cherished garbs. Read that caption again. The Beau Brummel of the Moro. Beau Brummel was the most famous fashion icon of Regency England, a man whose taste and style influenced an entire generation of European aristocracy. And here's a Filipino leader being compared to him, leader of the feminine 400, a reference to the 400, the most exclusive social elite in New York City at that time. These aren't random nicknames, these are deliberate comparisons to the highest levels of Western fashion and society. The fair organizers saw the sophistication, they acknowledged it in the caption. Fancy dress, most cherished garbs, fashion leaders. These are people described as fashion leaders, wearing elaborate traditional clothing with intricate embroidery, fine fabrics, sophisticated design elements, clothing that required advanced textile production, skilled artisans, complex dyeing techniques. And they're standing in a crude thatched hut village that's supposed to represent their primitive lifestyle. The disconnect is glaring. It's right there in the photograph. These aren't primitive people in primitive clothing, living in primitive houses. These are sophisticated people in fine clothing, displayed in degrading conditions. The fair organizers saw it too. That's why they highlighted the clothing, but they framed it as exotic curiosity instead of evidence of civilization. What if that clothing was the last remnant of an architectural and cultural sophistication that had to be forgotten? What if these people were dressed for formal occasions in societies that built with stone and metal and precision engineering, but that couldn't be shown at the fair because it would contradict the narrative? So instead, thatched huts, daily dog-eating performances, athletic competitions designed to prove inferiority, strip away the dignity, degrade the culture, display it for 20 million people. Make sure everyone sees that these populations are backward and need Western civilization to progress. Within 2 generations, nobody remembers what they actually came from. The sophisticated architecture couldn't have been them. The advanced metalworking must have been someone else. The precision engineering? Impossible for primitives, because millions of people saw them eating dogs in crude villages. That's what sticks. The fairs left traces. The Missouri Historical Society has exhibits about the 1904 fair. They acknowledge the human zoos. They call them controversial. They recognize the racism. They've even apologized in the careful institutional language of museums, trying to reckon with their own history. But they frame it as a product of its time. Scientific racism, social Darwinism, colonial ideology, all real, all documented, all terrible manifestations of 19th and early 20th century thinking. What they don't question is the fundamental premise, that the people on display were actually from primitive societies. The exhibits were racist, yes. The treatment was inhumane, absolutely. But were the victims actually primitives being exploited? Or were they advanced peoples being deliberately portrayed as primitives? The records are incomplete. The origins of many participants are vague. From the Philippines, or from Dahomey, without specific villages or families. Some were paid performers who agreed to participate. Some were essentially prisoners with no choice. Some were somewhere in between, pressured, coerced, promised opportunities that never materialized. Many were renamed when they arrived, given Western names or simplified versions of their actual names for American audiences who couldn't be bothered to pronounce unfamiliar sounds. Just like the orphan trains, just like the children scattered across the Midwest with new identities and told to forget where they came from. By the time anyone thinks to ask where they actually came from, everyone who knew is dead. That's the pattern. Displace, rename, display, humiliate, wait 2 generations, then the truth is gone. The last major World's Fair human zoo was in 1940. After World War II, the practice became too obviously horrific to continue. The world had seen what happens when you categorize humans as inferior, and the appetite for ethnological exhibits disappeared. But by then, the damage was done. Tens of thousands of people had been displayed. Millions of visitors had consumed the message that these populations were primitive. The photographs show otherwise. The historical records show resistance. The architectural evidence shows sophistication. But the narrative stuck. These were savage peoples that Western civilization uplifted. Even now, when we look back at the world's fairs, we say, yes, that was racist. Yes, that was wrong. Yes, we shouldn't have done that. But we rarely ask, were they actually primitive or were they made to look primitive? We don't question whether the thatched huts matched their actual architecture. We don't ask why the traditional clothing shows such advanced craftsmanship. We don't wonder why participants refuse to cooperate with being measured and categorized. We accept that they were from uncivilized places and that Western racism exploited them. What if they were from very civilized places and Western powers were erasing the evidence? If you wanted to erase a civilization from history, displaying its descendants as primitives in front of 20 million witnesses would be an effective method. You wouldn't have to kill everyone. You just have to make sure that when people thought of these populations, they thought backward, savage, primitive. Then, when someone discovers sophisticated architecture in those regions, the response is, no, that can't be from them. They were primitive. Someone else must have built it. The world's fairs weren't just entertainment. They were education. They taught millions of people how to think about entire continents of human beings. And if those human beings were actually from advanced civilizations that needed to be forgotten, what better way than to put them on display and call them savages? The photographs, remember. The people in those formal studio portraits, with their sophisticated clothing and dignified bearing. The records, remember. The resistance. The refusal to be categorized. The deaths from despair. The architecture remembers. The precision that shouldn't exist if the narrative is true. But we were taught not to see it. We were taught that these were primitive peoples being exploited by racist colonial powers. And maybe that's all it was. Or maybe it was something bigger. Something that required degrading thousands of people in front of millions of witnesses. Something that had to be forgotten so completely that even the photographs wouldn't make us question the story. Because the photographs are still there, in the Library of Congress, in the Missouri Historical Society archives, available online. Anyone can see them. The man in the suit, the woman with the intricate embroidery, the fashion leaders standing in crude huts, the sophisticated metalwork, the dignified bearing. We just stopped asking why there's a contradiction. Maybe because we were taught not to see it. Taught that these were primitive peoples being exploited by racist colonizers. Or maybe because 20 million witnesses saw them as savages first. And once you've convinced that many people, the photographs don't matter anymore. The truth is right there in those studio portraits. The Gerhard sisters captured it. The sophistication, the civilization, the evidence that contradicts everything the fair organizers claimed. We're just not looking.